Hello folks, welcome to the Darktable Landscapes video. This one is aimed primarily at those of you who are coming to Darktable from Adobe Lightroom, whether you're looking to save some money from the subscription fee or whether you're just curious about what Darktable can do, this is the video for you. Darktable is, at first glance, a lot more technical and involved than Lightroom. Lightroom has a very smooth and refined interface that they've honed over a number of years. Darktable looks more complicated and in some ways is, but in many ways is just as simple as Lightroom. It's really an exercise in knowing what you can ignore and what you can make use of. So in this video, I'm going to go through a complete workflow with Lightroom in mind, but using Darktable. I'm going to be using this image of the Forest of Brewer in northern Scotland, and we're going to be taking it from a relatively plain, unprocessed shot to this kind of more punchy autumnal shot. So let's get going. So before we start processing, it's worth looking at what the main differences are between Darktable and Lightroom in terms of workflow. In Lightroom, you have the kind of linear tool panel down the side, and you just make your way down the panel, processing as you go. And by the time you've got to the bottom, you've got a processed image. Darktable works slightly differently in that it's modular. So every image has a kind of a default stack of modules that gets the image on the screen, and then we can add modules as we see fit. We can have multiple instances of some modules if we want to, and so we build up the processing by adding in these modules as we go along. So what I'd like to do is go through the Lightroom panel and compare and contrast what modules we'll use in Darktable to essentially achieve the same effect as we would with Lightroom. So let's get going on that. So the basics panel, as I'm sure you're familiar with, looks like this. And the first thing that we'll often do is crop. So the module that we use for that in Darktable is handily called crop. And then we have the profile, what they call the profile in Lightroom, which is handled in Darktable with the 3D LUTS module. And then color calibration is what handles white balance. And then the exposure module handles exposure. And then contrast, there's a number of ways you can handle contrast in Darktable, and in general you use a couple of them in conjunction with each other. Using Darktable really kind of gets over the fact that a lot of raw processing is in fact just adding contrast at different levels and different localities, if you like. So there's a number of ways of adding and manipulating contrast in Darktable, and we'll cover a few in this video. And then finally, we have what Lightroom calls presence, so texture, clarity, and dehaze, which again are just different forms of contrast. So we'll be using color balance RGB, maybe the tone equalizer, and we'll use the contrast equalizer for those presences as well. So here we are in Darktable, and at first glance it looks similar to Lightroom in the way it's set up, with the image on the left and the panel on the right. But this is basically the module stack, so it's not linear. As I said, we don't go down through this like we do in Lightroom. Instead, we add modules to it. Now, there are various ways you can kind of customize this panel, but the way I like to work is just by using the search box here to type in the name of the module I'm going to use. So as we saw in the little slide before, the first thing we probably want to do is crop. So I'm going to crop off some of this image, maybe the left and the top. There's not much going on, so let's crop in. So I just type crop, and then you can either turn the module off or on with a little power button here in the corner. Whoops, that's change my search. So you can turn that on, or you can just start making an adjustment by kind of clicking and opening it, and then it will kick in. So you've got various presets for aspect ratios. I'm just going to use freehand for now. And then cropping is pretty self-explanatory. You can click in the corner or you can click on a side to adjust where you want to crop from. Let's go for that. And then if you want to kind of commit the change, if you like, you can just click on the title of the module again. Okay, so now we'll go for exposure. So exposure is one of the default modules. So that's always on. Unless you have something odd like maybe a process DNG that doesn't always include them, but exposure is always on, and it will usually compensate for whatever exposure compensation you had at the time. In this case, I think exposure is pretty good. You can see on our histogram we've got a pretty good range. Now there's an extra step when you're doing exposure in Darktable, and that's the tone mapping. So the raw file will have information on more tones than a monitor can display. So tone mapping, which is something that all raw processors do, including Lightroom, raw tone mapping is the way of kind of smushing those tones down into a value that the monitor can display. Smushing is a technical term. Whereas in Lightroom, it's kind of hidden and it just does it for you automatically. In Darktable, you have more control over that process. So there are two tone mapping modules. One's called Sigmoid and one's called Filmic RGB. Sigmoid is slightly newer, and that's the one I tend to use. And so this lets us kind of change how the tones are mapped, basically in terms of contrasts and the skew. So we're kind of where the tones are weighed towards either shadows or highlights. So I'm just going to skew up a little bit here, because we've got a bit more room at this end of the histogram. And we can also do things like raising the black. So let's just raise the black point a little bit here. Let's say 0.1. So if you ever want to type in a value, whereas in Lightroom you kind of double click, in Darktable you can right click and that will let you type in a value. So I'll just type in 0.1. That's fine. We can always come back and change these later on. Okay, so now we'll look at white balance. So if we refer back to our slide, you can see that it's handled by the color calibration module. So here is the color calibration module. So this is added again by default. There is a white balance module further down here, but this is kind of base white balance. We normally leave this alone, and then we adjust the white balance with this color calibration module, which looks very technical with all kinds of illuminance and all that kind of thing. But in general, you can just get away with clicking the eyedropper, and that will display on the image a box, and that's the box that Darktable is checking over to get a white balance. If you want to make that more accurate, maybe you want to focus on a neutral tone, you can just click and drag that box to focus on something that you want, or you can just drag it over the whole thing. Generally, the automatic does a pretty good job, but you can adjust by moving the hue back and forth and fine-tuning it to your liking. So that's pretty good for me. So we're going for that kind of slightly warm autumnal look. So we're kind of building that up with lots of small adjustments, and one of them is the white balance. So let's skew it actually slightly towards the right more. There we go. Okay, so now we can start adding some contrast. So as I said before, raw processing is mainly an exercise in manipulating contrast in various ways. So let's add just some general global contrast using the color balance RGB module, which is a super powerful module, one I use a lot. So let's pop it on, and we've got things like global vibrance and contrast. So we can just do a general global boost, and I will add some vibrance and a bit more contrast. There we go. And then we can affect things like the saturation in different channels, shadows, midtones, highlights, and so on. So normally what I like to do is add more saturation in the shadows, slightly less in the midtones, and slightly less again in the highlights, which mimics how we perceive colors in different tones pretty naturally. So that's something I do quite a lot. And now let's look at the brilliance grading. So this is really where we're handling contrast at a fine level. So let's drop the shadows. You can see how that's darkening just our shadows. Let's boost the highs a little bit. Now we can see we're starting to kind of clip a little bit here. So let's bring the highlights down. It's pretty good. We can also just do a general brilliance drop. There we go. Yeah, that's fine. Now I'd like to add some midtone contrast, which gives me the opportunity to talk about Darktable's masking features, which are very powerful, something that Darktable's had for a long time. Lightroom, not quite as long. It's only just really kind of coming into its own now in Lightroom, the masking. And in fact, every module has its own set of masks. So rather than a separate kind of masking area, then with different adjustments that you do in Lightroom, in Darktable, every module has access to masks, so you can mask any module however you want it. So for midtone contrasts, I want to adjust contrast, so I'm going to use the color balance RGB module, but I don't want to use this one, which I've used to kind of affect contrast globally. I want a new and separate module. So I can do that very easily by right clicking this button here. And you can see that we get a new instance. It's called Color Balance RGB2. And you can rename a module or relabel a module rather in Darktable by control clicking in the panel at the top. And I'm going to call this Midtone Contrast. There we go. So now let's have a look at masking. There are various masking options at the bottom of each panel, but the main ones are drawn mask, which is drawing a shape or a gradient to define where the mask hits. A parametric mask, so that's using a parameter of the image like brightness, color, various other things to make a selection. And then there's drawn and parametric, which mixes the two. So for this midtone mask, I'm just going to use a parameter. So I'm going to look at the tones of the image. So let's click parametric mask and we'll scroll down. And then we have the various parameters that we can make use of. So grays, which is the tone, the red, green and blue channel, and then some kind of different color space versions of those. So JZ here, JZ is essentially a different tone selector. And then you have CZ, which is chromaticity, so saturation, and HZ, which is color. So in this case, we want to use just the simple tones of the image. So first thing we want to do is turn on the preview. So I'll click that on here and you can see everything is turned bright yellow. That's because essentially we're selecting everything at the moment, and yellow is the color that Darktable uses to show where a mask is being applied. So to select the midtones, we essentially want to deselect the darks. And you can see we have two sliders here, one on the top, one on the bottom. And if we drag the bottom one back, we're kind of smoothing out the difference in tones between these two sliders. So it creates a smooth transition between the tones. So we'll go for deselecting the darks, and now we want to deselect the lights. So now we're just selecting the midtones of the image. Again, we'll drag this back to smooth out the transition. Okay, so we're no longer selecting the darkest or the brightest parts of the image, we're just selecting the midtones. There's quite a few midtones in this image. As it happens, it was a kind of an overcast evening where I took the shot. So the edges of our mask are quite kind of harsh now, so we can go down to our mask refinement section and we can give it some feathering. There we go, let's say 50 pixels, so right click and then we can enter a hard value if we want to. We can also blur the mask in general. We can do various other things like change the contrast of the mask, the opacity of the mask, and that kind of thing. But that's fine for now. So we'll turn our preview off, now knowing that we've just selected our midtones, and now we can build in some contrast. So I think I'd probably just go for a simple contrast slider at the top here, maybe a slight shadows drop and a slight highlight drop. And if you want to see the difference between the adjustments you've made and before and after, you can just turn the module off and on. So you can just see some subtle midtone contrast coming in there. Okay, so now we'll look at the next part of the panel, which is the presence panel, clarity, texture, and dehaze. There's not much to dehaze in this particular image, so I won't go into dehaze too much, but the tools are very similar. There is a haze removal module in Darktable, which does a pretty good job, kind of automatically. But for clarity and texture, we use a tool called the contrast equalizer, as you can see there. So let's have a look at that one. So we'll go into our search box, we'll type contrast, and here's our contrast equalizer. And for something that's roughly analogous to clarity, we can roll our mouse wheel down to change the area of effect of this this little graph here, this little line, and we can click and drag up. You can see because we've made our area of influence very big, it's kind of doing a subtle general overall adjustment, and you can see the difference that's made already to the image. That's essentially analogous to clarity. Okay, so I think that's enough. As ever, it's just as easy in Darktable to overdo clarity as it is in Lightroom, so we'll not do too much. But we do have a lot of kind of nice texture in these rocks and the trees and leaves and things, so we'll pull some out, and I will again control click and call this clarity. And again, I'll right click to make a new instance of this on this little kind of two squares icon here, because we use the same tool for texture. So I'll just rename this to texture. And for texture, we just keep the area of influence the same size, and we just drag up either end. So this is kind of coarse features, and then this is fine features. So for fine texture, we increase this a little bit more. And we do have a lot of fine texture in this image, so I'm going to pull this one up a little bit more. Let's see how that's affected things. Yeah, just pull the texture out a little bit more of this kind of lichen covered rock especially. So that's the more or less the end of the basics panel. We'll go on to the next one now. Okay, so the next panel in Lightroom is the tone curve panel, which is of course another way of adjusting contrast in various ways. If you use the kind of combined curve, then you're adjusting contrast, and then you can also use the RGB channels as well. There are a couple of ways you can do this in Darktable. There's a tone curve module, which, as the name suggests, is very similar. There's an RGB curve, which lets you adjust the individual channels. There's color balance RGB, which we've already looked at, achieves much the same result. And there's also tone equalizer. We'll look at tone equalizer for this one because the tone curve and RGB curve modules are very similar in how they work in pretty much any image editor, Photoshop, Affinity, Lightroom, anything. A curve editor is a curve editor. So we'll look at the tone equalizer because it's a little bit more unique to Darktable. So let's switch back over and we'll see what we can do here. So we'll go for tone EQ. And what the tone equalizer does is it divides the image up into 9 zones of different tones. You can see how it divides it up by clicking this button here. So here's the darkest zone here, and there's the lightest tone here in the waterfall, and then there's all the tones in between. So it's similar to the zone system put forward by Ansel Adams for black and white film photography, just translated into the modern digital age, if you like. And what it allows us to do is make some quite kind of fine-grained contrast adjustments quite easily. So I'm going to turn this preview off. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to make use of a preset. So some modules have lots of presets. Normally the more complicated modules, they include more presets to make it easier to work out how to use them. Some modules have no presets because they're pretty simple. This one has a few. And the one I'm going to use here is Contrast Tone Curve Soft. So you can see how that looks very similar to the S-curve in a standard kind of tone curve tool. But we can adjust these kind of individually. So if we feel like I do here that the darker tones are perhaps a little too dark, we can just drag them up like that. If we want to reset the curve, we can double click. So that's how the default. We'll go back to our preset. So I'm just going to basically use this preset but shallow off the curve a little bit because it's a little too contrasty for my liking. We have already added contrast with color balance RGB. So that's one way of adjusting the curve. You can also move the mouse into the image. You can see how my crosshair is changing here. So let's say, for example, we think this waterfall is a bit too bright here. We can just roll our mouse wheel down to lower the curve down. You can see how it's affecting the point on the right hand side as well. Or we can roll it up if you want to brighten things up. So that's another way of doing it when you're actually hovering over the actual tone that you want to adjust. And you can change how various things like curve smoothing, how it affects the tones next to it in the tone mask. But that's the tone equalizer tool. So our next panel in Lightroom is the HSL or color panel, which lets you adjust colors kind of in a quite fine grain way and shift their hues, their saturations, and their luminance. And in Darktable, that's handled with a relatively new module called Color Equalizer. So let's have a look at that one. So we'll go to our search box, we'll type in Color EQ or EQ, there we go. And you can see that we have a similar range of tools. We have hue, saturation, and brightness, and we have points similar to our tone equalizer that we can drag up and down to adjust these things. So I want to maybe adjust the hue of these greens a little bit more towards the yellow. We want to get that autumnal feel. So we can click this eyedropper here where it says node placement, and we can click on a green, and that will show us on the panel here where that green lies. And then we can use the node placement slider to move that node over so it lies roughly in the right place. And then we can drag this down, and you can see that we're starting to shift things now towards the yellow side of things. Now, again, less is more. I don't want to do too much on there. I am going to do some color adjustment with a different module later on. So I'm just going to keep it around about there and just shift it a little bit and maybe increase the saturation of those a touch as well. So we just go to the saturation tab. You can also adjust the brightness. So I'm just going to go crazy here and adjust it way up and way down so you can see how it affects that. And you can nudge these along as much as you like. You can mask this as well, like anything else. So if you really wanted to narrow it down to a color range, you could maybe use a color mask. If you only wanted to affect the brightest colors, you could use a tones mask. And there's any number of ways you can customize this to your liking. So the next panel is the color grading panel, where you can adjust shadows, highlights, and midtones in terms of their color. And for this one, we actually use the color balance RGB module again, or at least I do, for just kind of very broad range shadows, highlights, and midtones, rather than a fine grading like we've got with Color Equalizer. We just use color balance RGB. So let's head on back over into Darktable, and we'll go back to our color balance RGB. So remember, we had two instances of it. One we use for midtone contrast and one for global. So I'll go back to my global one. And for this one, we're going to flip over to the four ways tab. And you can see that we have similar controls. So shadows, highlights, and power, which is essentially midtones. And we can change their luminance, their brightness. And we can also change the hue, the tint to those tones. So let's add a little bit of coolness to the shadows, a little bit of kind of blue, slightly indigo. So we'll choose our hue, and it's a very powerful effect. So if you add way too much, then things will look very weird very quickly. So normally you're hovering around kind of the 2 to 3% mark, if not less. Let's go for about 2%. So I'll just right click, type in 2. There we go. And we can do the same thing. So if you wanted to add, say, color to a sunrise where the clouds are bright but haven't really captured the color, you can add that with highlights and a little bit of midtones in the same way. You can also affect the luminance of these tonal ranges as well from here. There's lots of ways to skin the cat in Darktable, as with more complicated software like, so for example, Photoshop. There's always several ways of doing anything. But this is just a nice, quick and simple way. 2 sliders and your color grading. So the next panel in Lightroom is the detail panel, which handles sharpening and noise reduction in one. In Darktable, there are 2 separate modules for doing this. There's Diffuse Sharpen, which handles sharpening and also diffusion if you want to add haze effects. And there's Denoise Profiled for handling noise reduction. Now, because of the way that Darktable produces an image preview, which is kind of on the fly, as opposed to Lightroom's generate to preview when you import, and then it modifies that preview when you do edits, Darktable's generating kind of a new preview every time. So the Diffuse Sharpen module can kind of hit performance quite hard. It's CPU intensive. It does a great job, but it's CPU intensive or GPU intensive if using a GPU. So it's actually something I normally leave to the end of the workflow, and I'll come back to that for that reason at the end of this workflow. But noise reduction is something we can do anytime. So let's head back over to Darktable, and we'll type in Denoise Profiled. And essentially, Darktable has access to a large database of cameras, and it has profiles for all their sensors at all their different ISOs, and does a pretty good job from that of denoising an image. So normally denoising is simply a matter of turning on the Denoise Profiled module, and away you go. That does a decent job. It's 99% of the time that's all I'll use, and so I won't go into great detail into extra options for this particular video, but we'll look at that perhaps at a later time. And the next module, the next panel in Lightroom is lens corrections. So that normally fixes distortion, lens vignetting, and also does chromatic aberration fixing as well. In Darktable, there's a lens correction module, and there's a separate chromatic aberration module. So let's head back into Darktable and have a look at those. They're very simple. They're normally just a matter of turning them on. And again, Darktable's database handles the rest. So there's lens correction. This is a Fuji RAW file, so it has the metadata for that kind of thing embedded. Your mileage may vary with different cameras. One thing you can do in Darktable that I don't think you can do in Lightroom is you can choose what corrections are applied. So if you're not particularly bothered about the distortion, but you do want, say, for example, the chromatic aberration handled, you can change that option in this drop down here. So you can only fix the distortion, or you can only fix the chromatic aberration, or you can kind of do a combination of any of them. I generally leave it all on, but you know, that's entirely up to you. And now we'll also do the chromatic aberration. I don't think there's a great deal of chromatic aberration in this shot because it was a fairly overcast day, and normally chromatic aberration rears its ugly head when you have high contrast like sun through the leaves and that kind of thing. But you can simply turn that on, and for the most part it does a good job automatically, but you can adjust the radius and the strength and what particular color you're trying to affect as well. So the next panel in Lightroom is effects, which is where we do vignetting and grain. In Darktable there is a dedicated vignetting module, but I actually prefer to use the exposure module, or rather kind of a separate instance of the exposure module. It just generally gives a nicer result in my opinion, but you're welcome to try out the vignetting module as well. And there's a grain module which can add grain if you want it. It's not something I use a great deal of, and it's fairly similar in terms of the controls to Lightroom, just the amount and the kind of the coarseness of the grain. So let's look at vignetting here with the exposure module. So I'll switch back to Darktable. I'll type in exposure, and we've already got one exposure module from our kind of default, but I want a new instance of that because I don't want to affect the original kind of base exposure. There we go. So we'll pop that on, and we'll use a drawn mask for this. So I'll click the draw mask tool, and you can see that we've got several shapes that we can make use of. So let me just, oops, there we go. We have a circle, we have an ellipse, we have a kind of a path that we can draw a kind of a custom shape. We have a brush, and we have a good old-fashioned linear gradient. So similar to the shape tools that you have in the masking panel in Lightroom, I'm going to use an ellipse for obvious reasons. We're doing a vignette, so an ellipse makes sense that we could do a custom shape if we wanted to. So let me zoom back out, and you can see that we've got our ellipse shape drawn that we can drag around. The inner solid line is the kind of the start of the effect, and then the dotted line on the outside here is the fade, the feathering on the effect. We can roll our mouse wheel to shrink or expand, and we can shift roll to change the feathering radius as well. So I'm going to go for something like this. Now by default, pretty sure that's the same in Lightroom as well, by default this mask will be affecting inside. So if I turn on the mask preview, you can see that we're going to be affecting everything in the yellow, which is the middle of the image. We don't want that, we want to invert it. So instead we go to this button here, which says toggle polarity of draw mask. We'll do that. And now you can see that we're affecting outside our mask. So I'll just pop the preview off. Now we can adjust our exposure down. There we go. Now I want to give it a slightly more subtle feather, and we can also adjust feathering radius here, which kind of softens off the effect even further. There we go. And again, we can mask this further. So a drawn mask here is just affecting where you draw, or outside where you draw in this case. But for example, if you wanted highlight protection, you didn't want to darken highlights unnaturally, you could use a drawn and parametric mask and just exclude your highlights with the slider here that we used for our mid-tone contrast. It's the same idea, just exclude the high tones, and all of a sudden you're not vignetting the highlights. But for this one, we're fine with just a drawn mask. I think that's pretty good. And then finally, right at the bottom of Lightroom, we come to the calibration panel, which is where you can change your kind of primary input colors from the sensor. And in Darktable, we have a very similar module, which is called RGB primaries. So let's have a look at this. And this is where I'm going to use this. I'm going to use this module to do some more kind of extreme, if you like, color grading. So let's have a look. We'll go for RGB primaries, pop it on, and you can see the controls are very similar: red hue, red purity, green hue, green purity, and so on. Purity essentially roughly analogous to the saturation tab in the sliders in color calibration in Lightroom. So let's see what we can do. We need to really make this So let's get our autumn feel on the go. So let's have a look. We'll go for quite a big shift in the red tones. Let's go kind of, yeah, about 11. And our red purity will go for about 25. And then let's drop our greens. We want to take some green out of there. Shift it more towards yellow. Just drop our 6 there, about that I think is pretty good. We'll drop our blues more towards cyan. And we'll go, say, 15 or so. We'll increase our purity, I think, about 10. Then maybe a tint. So you can see we've really shifted those greens towards yellow. But we need to just give it a bit more of a general autumny kind of feel. So we'll go for about 40 on the tint. We'll go to maybe 4 or 5% on the purity there. So you can see now we've really shifted everything much more towards an autumnal feel. So there's our before, there's our after. And for a final bit of color adjustment, we saw that in the first panel there is a kind of a Darktable version of the profiles that you get in the basics panel of Lightroom, where you can kind of choose a preset kind of treatment, and that's called the 3D LUTS, 3D Lookup Table module, LUT 3D. And that's just a matter of downloading some lookup table files from the likes of On1. There's various websites. I'll put some links in the description below where you can get free lookup tables, LUTS, and you can simply choose a file, and that will apply the color adjustments to it. So I'm going to do that now. There we go. So I've chosen Landscape 8. This is one of the On1 free ones, but you can see it's a very strong effect, and it's way too strong, really. So if you want to adjust something over the entire image, you can use the uniform mask, which is this circle, available on every module again, and then you can just adjust the opacity. So let's drop this right down. Just want to give that kind of, I like the little vibe it gives of the slight fade and the autumn feel again. So let's go maybe 15. My watchword is less is more. Yeah, just giving things a little bit more of a tone. Let's go slightly stronger, 20%. There we go. That's just a good way to make some little final adjustments quickly without fiddling with every little thing. And I mentioned before how we generally leave sharpening right to the end. So let's do that now. And I mentioned we use the Diffuse and Sharpen module. So let's grab an instance of that. So it's quite a complicated module, and I rarely dip into the actual controls one by one. As I said at the beginning, a lot of using Darktable is kind of knowing what you can leave alone and just leave at the defaults and what you can adjust. And the makers of Darktable, or rather the maker of this module, because modules are often made separately by different people, realizes this, and so provides a lot of presets for common situations. So I'll right click the panel and you can see that we've got presets for bloom, dehaze, denoising, various things, but what we're interested in is the sharpening presets. And I generally use a mix of two. I use the demosaicing sharpening, and then I use the lens sharpening. So the first one I use is sharpen demosaicing no AA filter, because my camera doesn't have an anti-aliasing filter, so I'll choose that, and it will work away. And my computer isn't the greatest in the world, so it does take a little longer. You may have a much better system than me, and it's much quicker. But that does a great job of sharpening up from the get-go. So if I zoom in here, which is just a middle click on the image, turn the sharpening off and on, you can see how that's really sharpened things up quite considerably, but quite naturally. There's no haloing or anything like that. And now I said I like to do a couple of these, so we'll right click to make a new instance. We'll right click again to bring up our presets menu, and then we'll do, let's do lens deblur soft. It's not a particularly terrible lens, it's a nice sharp lens, so it doesn't need too much. There we go, we'll pop that on as well. It will work away, and it will give us an extra level of sharpening that kind of compensates for the softening of a lens. That final subtle level of sharpening there. And there's one other thing I like to use Diffuse Sharpen for. So I'll make another instance. I'll right click for a new preset and I will use local contrast fast. And that just adds some local contrast. Can often be a slightly too strong effect. So I'm going to use a uniform mask again to soften it off. Let's drag this down to about 50. There we go. And we'll look at the difference. Just adds a little touch of local contrast, which is nice. Call this local contrast. So there we go. So another thing that Lightroom provides is the ability to kind of see a before and after view, and we can do that in Darktable as well. I'm going to close the tool panel on the right and I'll open them on the left. And you can see here we have a history of all the adjustments we've made to the image. So you can click back through this history at any time to kind of jump back in time to that point. The first thing I want to do before I jump back in time to the beginning, for our before shot, is take a snapshot of the current state. So this is the finished image. I'm going to take a snapshot here and it'll pop it up here in this panel. And I can scroll down, and so you can see these first 9 modules, or even 10, 11, where the tone mapper kicks in, sigmoid. These first 11 modules are the defaults that are applied. We can turn them off, but normally we turn them on. These first 5 are ones that definitely have to be there if you want to be able to see an image. So I will go to, let's go to the crop, otherwise we'll kind of get weird changes. So we'll go to crop. So we've jumped back in time through our module stack to our first crop. And now if we go back to our snapshot, click Diffuse Sharpen, that's where the snapshot was taken. Just close this panel down, and we've got this little slider here with the S for snapshot. And when we drag that across, you can see that it's applying the snapshot to the timeline. So you can see that geometry change that's coming from lens correction, but it gives you a good idea of the changes you've made. So we've obviously made this a lot less green, a lot more stylized, a lot more autumnal. If you want to make this horizontal rather than vertical, you can click this little arrow in the middle and it will let you wipe the other way, so to speak. So that's how you can do a before and after as well with Darktable. So one final thing I like to do with more or less all my images is add a frame. I don't think that's something you can actually do easily in Lightroom. Correct me if I'm wrong. But I can add a frame. I can pop that module on. The default is a 10% white frame around the outside. You can change that. I prefer 5%, so I've made a preset. Making a preset is very easy. You just make your adjustments in your module, click the little hamburger menu, and you can add a preset there. Because I'm using a preset already, it's saying edit this preset. So let's reset, which is this little circle with a vertical line, like a power button. We'll make adjustment. Let's say I want a 7% border for whatever reason. You can click the hamburger, store new preset, and then we can name it and save it, and then you've got it for later on. So that's our finished image, and that's more or less the end of the guide. Hopefully it's given you some confidence to give Darktable a try. It's completely free. It's available on Windows, Mac and Linux. So you've got nothing to lose and possibly quite a lot to gain. So do give it a try. Check out my other videos if you'd like more tips and tricks, because I've really only touched the surface here. And like and subscribe and you'll see all the ones I put out in the future if you haven't already. And I will catch you on the next one.